Hey everybody, let's jump into our tutorial on variables. As you can see, I have Visual Studio open up here, and I have our standard beginner code of the Hello World program. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a comment into Visual Studio. You start a comment by writing these two forward slashes. What these two forward slashes indicate to the computer is that the rest of this line will not be part of your program. So when the computer, it starts up here to read your program, starts up here like we discussed in the last video, it goes sequentially through each line. If it sees a line that starts with this, it doesn't read the rest of it. So the computer knows that this is not computer code. I'll be using these comments to sort of help us along and help define things as we move through this tutorial. So starting out, let's talk about variables. So what is a variable? A variable represents the storage location. I'll explain a little bit more on what that means by defining a variable now. I'm going to define a variable that is the type of string. I'll get into what all this means in just a second. I'm going to give it the name greeting, and I'm going to set it equal to Hello Pete, and I'm going to end it with a semicolon. So now, to define what a variable is, I'm going to go through each one of these different parts and talk about what they represent. I'm going to space them out now by hitting Tab so that I have enough space between them to make a comment. So let's go back to our definition of a variable. A variable represents a storage location. Okay, what is a storage location? A storage location is a space in memory that the computer sets aside for data. So if you want the computer to remember a word, the computer needs to set aside space in memory to store that word. If you want it to remember a number, it needs to set aside the space to store a number. Now, the space to store a word is different from the space to store a number. So when the computer sets aside this space, it needs to know what the data going in is going to be, so it can set aside the appropriate amount of space. We tell the computer how much space to set aside for a variable using a variable type. So this string keyword here is a type, a variable type. And I'll write a little definition down here. A variable type tells the computer how much space is needed for some specific data. That's the variable type. And we're going to have another video on types in the future. The next video will be about variable types. But for right now, all you need to know is the type string. And a string represents a string of letters, so words, essentially. The next part of this variable is greeting here. And this is the variable name. The variable name is more so used for people. So this is just sort of to help us understand what this data represents. So in the same way that the type sort of tells the computer what kind of data the variable has in it, the name sort of tells us people what kind of data the variable will have in it. So names can be very useful if they describe the data accurately, or they can be almost harmful if they don't describe the data accurately. Because if you look at a variable, for example, that's named greeting and it doesn't have a greeting, then you're going to be misled as to what that variable's purpose is. So we have our type and we have our name. The next piece is the assignment operator. I'll create a little bit more space down here. Operator. And we'll get into operators a little bit more later in this course. Right now, all you need to know is that this equal sign means that greeting equals this data. The next piece of a variable is the value. So the value of this variable is hello Pete. So we have a variable called greeting whose value is hello Pete. The value is the data that will be stored in the memory location. And so at the end, we have our semicolon here. The semicolon represents the end of an instruction for the code. So semicolons are not just used for variables, they're used to end instructions. So for example, if we look down here at console write line, it has a semicolon at the end because this signifies the end of this instruction. In the same way that for our variable up here, the semicolon signifies the end of that instruction as well. So just down here, I'll recap using comments what each of these parts represent. So the name is a human readable description of the data. The assignment operator separates the name and type from the value of the variable. The value of a variable is the data that is stored in memory. Oops. And we have semicolon, which represents, it tells the computer that the instruction is finished. So this is your basic variable example, and this is sort of like are the labels of each of the variable parts. Now we'll get into, in the next videos, we'll get into the relationship between the type and the value.